Problem of Prejudice by Mariah Brin, Mason Peralta, Salem Porter, Caden Tugas, and Cameron Torres. The struggle for the nature of prejudice. This refers to the ongoing philosophical and psychological conversation around prejudice. Prejudice is often perceived as a preconceived negative judgment or stereotype. This is often defined as one's opinion towards an individual or a group. The struggles within the nature of prejudice and how to unlearn the biases that have been ingrained into some traditions, races, groups, etc. Relinquishing prejudice. The nature of prejudice in our ever-changing society. Beliefs and views towards individuals or groups in a negative way. Beliefs based off gender, race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or even social groups. Preconceived negative opinions. The influence of society and the media. Multifaceted views that have adapted and changed over the course of time with media and society influence. However, prejudices are still there amongst most, if not all, social groups. The strategic nature of prejudice explained. Two-factor model of prejudice. People acquire prejudice towards racial outgroups early in life. As people mature and with social norm changes, people learn to suppress their prejudices. Critique of the two-factor model. The two-factor model focuses on the influence of norms, values, and audiences on expressions of prejudice, while ignoring that expressions of prejudices can also influence these social elements. The two-factor method claims justification and suppression of expressions are mentally managed as acceptable for expression or internal belief, or rejected before they are expressed. The authors argue that justification and suppression happen after the expression is expressed, not before. Strategic nature of prejudice explained, Part 2. Social influence and prejudice. People adapt their prejudice expressions strategically to fit with social norms and audiences that are subject to social influence. People who are insecure in their identities can express out-group prejudice to promote acceptance and belonging. Exposure to others' belief systems can change prejudices. Limitations of research. Studies tend to predefine prejudice rather than allow study participants to give their own definition. Studies often do not account for the reaction of a live audience. Prejudice expression as identity performance. The struggle of prejudice expression as identity performance revolves around the root of prejudice, the placement of prejudice ideologies in society. The struggle of eradicating prejudice nature and tendencies from our society. Psychology theories and studies have shown that their methods are not equipped to explain the definition of prejudice in a sense of struggle amongst diverse groups. Identity performance has also contributed in a sense that society has placed certain expectations or stereotypes amongst groups or individuals that can be cited as being a root cause of prejudice, for reasons such as biases in response to certain groups or topics outside the norm. Prejudice as Identity Performance, Part 2. Space between prejudice and norms. A non-static arena wherein norms, attitudes, and identities are actively made rather than performed. Justification and suppression are actively occurring in conversation rather than before the conversation. Interactional nature of prejudice and suppression. Justification and suppression are honed through interaction, not through internal psychological processes alone. Dynamic definition of prejudice. Definitions of prejudice are constructed by individuals. Norms are established based on audience reception. What counts as prejudiced is what is agreed on as prejudiced. Prejudice as Identity Performance, Part 3. Prejudice as a social construct. The authors put prejudice in quotation marks to indicate the open-ended nature of the definition of the term. The meaning of prejudice depends on an agreement of the audience and is reached in a particular situation. Identity performances and prejudice. Identity is not a fixed trait, but is constructed by thoughts, behaviors, actions, and expressions, influenced by social constructs and expectations. These categories are constructed through conversation and engaging with the world. 3 ways prejudice is deployed in identity performance: constructing social categories of identification, producing explanations and accounts of social events, and mobilizing collective action. Mobilizing hate. Prejudice as a public tool, Part 1. Prejudice as a constructed tool in crisis. Leaders can actively create prejudice narratives during times of crisis, not just rely on inherited biases. Emotional and moral narratives frame the enemy as a threat and themselves as morally justified. Call to arms discourse, justifying action. These discourses often present action as essential and urgent, compelling populations to act. The first example, President George Bush's post 9/11 speech, which framed Americans as victims of terrorist evil, solidifying the us versus them narrative. Not prejudice, yet mobilizing hatred. These narratives claim to be not prejudice, yet the rhetoric actively promotes hostility towards the other. Key point, mobilizing hate isn't just based on pre-existing prejudices, it constructs new targets, identities, and norms. Creating new realities, the power of identity. New leaders craft narratives that, by labeling others as prejudiced, make their own group appear rational, moral, and unified. Mobilizing hate, prejudice as a public tool, part 2. Mobilizing minds, not just bodies. Prejudice functions as more than an emotional response, it also mobilizes mental frameworks, shaping how populations perceive and act. Leaders like George Creel emphasized shaping the minds of people to sustain war efforts. Constructing identity through crisis. Discourse like Bush's post 9/11 speech didn't just describe events, it redefined what it meant to be an American in opposition to terrorist others. This identity creation binds people to action. To belong is to oppose the enemy. Mobilizing hate. Prejudice as a public tool, part 3. Strategic framing. Prejudice as a virtue. Labeling the outgroup as prejudiced validates hostility as moral, strategic, and not prejudiced. This frames dissenters within the in-group as naive or dangerous, reinforcing conformity and shared animosity. From speech to action. Call to arms discourse uses prejudice to anchor reality transforming abstract hate into concrete group mobilization. This isn't irrational hostility, it's a socially constructed justification for collective behavior under a moral guise. Accusations and denials of prejudice. Modern norms against prejudice. In today's social climate, overt expressions of prejudice are widely condemned. As a result, people frequently disavow prejudice even as they express biased views. Common rhetorical strategies. I'm not prejudiced, but it's not about race, it's about culture. These rhetorical moves help speakers avoid accusations and remain part of the moral community. Denials don't erase the bias, they repackage it to make it more persuasive. Preserving the moral self. Such denials are part of a public performance of identity, where individuals project themselves as rational, fair, and unprejudiced regardless of their underlying attitudes. Functional contradiction. The denial of prejudice doesn't remove the prejudice. It makes it more socially acceptable and often more persuasive, especially when it's framed as a rational critique rather than hate. Accusations and denials of prejudice, part 2. Why is prejudice hard to reduce? Prejudice is hard to reduce because of accusations and denial. These lead to people developing a sense of the proper amount of prejudice and genuine prejudice. What is proper prejudice? When people associate the public image of an irrational bigot to prejudice, this allows more subtle acts of prejudice to be denied. Most people do not expect a prejudiced person to be calm and collected, which allows many people with prejudiced beliefs to distance themselves from the label prejudiced. What is genuine prejudice? This is when people excuse their derogatory actions as outbursts and insist that they are not bigoted. They are able to do this because what is considered prejudiced is entirely up to society's opinions, and therefore is constantly changing. This makes it hard for people to get a firm grasp on what is genuine or truly harmful prejudice. Accusations and denials of prejudice and repressing prejudice. How do people hide their prejudice? By showing sympathy or indifference towards the other group. Using sympathy to hide prejudice. Many will express sympathy for the hardships or obstacles the group they are being prejudiced against. They do this to make themselves appear more level-headed and empathetic, which means less people will see them as prejudiced. Using indifference to hide prejudice. Many who are prejudiced will also show indifference towards the affected group's differences to them. For example, anti-immigration supporters often either don't bring up race or claim that it has no effect on their opinion towards immigration. They do this to distance themselves from the stereotypical idea of a racist bigot so that their argument will seem more rational. This indifference can be applied to not just race, but also disability, sexuality, gender, or class. The blurring of lines between good and bad and prejudice and not prejudice are the reasons why prejudice is so hard to reduce. Stereotyping by implication. Durkheim brought up stereotyping by implication. This is when speakers allude to stereotypes without stating them outright. Example, I don't mind them as long as they behave. It implies said group often misbehaves or that their behavior is an issue. This gives more power to prejudice while not mentioning it. It treats people as the elephant in the room and allows prejudice to proceed without being called out. Conclusion. How Alport's The Nature of Prejudice shaped research of prejudice. It acknowledges the effects of prejudice on society, sought to find the psychological nature of prejudice, and over time has been refined and aspired to develop a psychological definition of prejudice. Two-factor models of prejudice are effective but flawed. These models have found that people are often forced to repress prejudice. The models have made great contributions but have one-directional views of social influence. They also ignore people's own definitions of prejudice and, by extension, the power that those definitions have. Conclusion Part 2. Social influences two-way channels. Prejudice is formed in arguments and debates. Prejudice is a collaborative process determined by the main group's opinion. Prejudice as identity performance. Prejudice-related identity performances. People change the way they act depending on who they are interacting with. Norms are defined by these identity performances, can be used to defend or change the current social reality. Prejudice is defined by these identity performances, which are defined by discourses and interactions.